All right, so first let's talk about the expense. People say that these programs are too expensive, and one of the most reliable figures cited is by the American Beverage Association and also the Bottle Bill Resource Guide, which is that advocacy group. The Beverage Association says that these programs are costly, and if you look at California, for example, there are several hundred jobs in the California's Redemption Center bureaucracy, and they spend tens of millions of dollars administering the program. That's obviously a substantial amount of money that could have been spent somewhere else. If you look at what the Bottle Bill Resource Guide sees, they find that to recycle each of these containers in a container deposit program costs about 1/4 of a cent more than it would if you turn them in at curbside. So that can add up quickly because people turn in hundreds of containers a year. 1/4 of a cent isn't much individually for that one can, but if you're talking about 1.1 billion containers, 1/4 of a cent is big money. And finally, time equals money. And for people who want to cash in their containers, they've got to take them down to the recycling center or to the store, and that takes time, and that is money, and it also takes fuel. In addition to expense, bureaucracies, hidden taxes, and transportation costs, there's also the inconvenience factor. Curbside is obviously much more convenient than any other option for a lot of people because all you have to do is take these cans, throw them in your bin outside, and walk them out to the curb. Returning containers also means that you have to make sure that they're clean and salvageable, and in some of these cases, these containers wouldn't be accepted by your store, but they would be accepted at curbside. It doesn't matter whether the can's flat at curbside because it's all going to get crushed anyway. But when you take them back to the store, they need to be able to scan these. Not an option that way. And oftentimes stores will only accept the brands that they sell. So if you wanted to take all these back to one store, you might not be able to because they don't carry each of those brands. In addition to inconvenience, another criticism of container deposit systems is that they don't do a lot of good for the environment for the amount of trouble that they cause. Container deposits, used containers make up about 3% of the waste stream, and that's according to the advocacy group, the Bottle Bill Resource Guide. So for 3% of the waste stream, you've got tens of millions of dollars spent. And special trips to the Redemption Center or to the store mean that you use fuel and time and energy and resources just to take these things back that could have been done another way. Finally, the added bureaucracy also means an expenditure of resources because if there's bureaucracy, there's office buildings, which means there's electricity, there's fuel spent by those people driving back and forth, there's all kinds of costs that add up to the environment just based on having to administer these programs. Now, bottle bills are obviously criticized as being unhelpful to the environment, and they're also expensive and inconvenient, but all of these criticisms can be addressed. Yes, they are more expensive. It is more to take these down to the Redemption Center, 1/4 of a cent more. But in states where there are container deposits, hundreds more containers per person each year are recycled. So you do spend a little bit more, but you get a large value for that. Some people criticize these as having a hidden tax. If you don't take your containers back, then you're paying a tax on top of what you were paying for the beverages. Now that's only true if you don't bother to take them back. If you take your containers back, you get your tax back. That's not much of a tax. I'd like to pay other taxes that way too. Inconvenience, well, most people are going to go to these same stores again. So that doesn't hold a lot of water because if you go to the store, you buy the things, you take them back to the same store, it's never going to be more than a few minutes. Also, about half of the United States lacks curbside recycling. So for those people, there isn't any option except to take them to transfer stations, and that is a special trip that you can't just make while you're driving to the store. Is it unhelpful? Well, it is a small part of the waste stream, there's no doubt about that. 3% is not a whole lot. But these are all easily recycled and valuable resources. So even though it doesn't represent a large amount of the waste stream, it does represent something that's very easy to convert back into a useful product. Unlike wadded up soiled paper, diapers, all kinds of other garbage, organic garbage, you can't recycle that as readily as you can these items. And that's really what it boils down to. These are valuable items to keep in the production stream. So now that we've talked about the criticisms and addressed them, the big question is, why should we have a bottle bill in Washington? It really boils down to 3 big benefits: litter reduction, job creation, And finally, conserving our natural resources. All of those are obvious goods that are very easy to accomplish. I'd like to urge you to contact your state legislators and ask them to start the work towards having a bottle bill in Washington. And I can provide you with contact information and other resources after we wrap up. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Yeah, I have a question whether has there been some activity on introducing the bottle bill? I mean, are there a lot of efforts?
Right. Okay, so Dana has asked us whether there's been activity in terms of introducing a bottle bill here in Washington. There have been some private efforts, but nothing has gotten into the state legislature and gained enough ground to be able to be something that we could just say, support House Bill 335. There isn't anything like that right now. What we need right now is for state legislators to start the process. They have to get it off the ground in the first place. Now, there's a lot of pressure to not do that from the Beverage Association and other lobbyists who don't want to see, pretty much some extra work added to their day. But these containers are their responsibility. They made them. They're our responsibility. We bought them. So this system would make it so that we could fulfill that responsibility much more easily and more efficiently.
So you're saying that PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are opposed to bottle bills?
Well, they're part of the American Beverage Association.
Well, they were just two examples, but I mean, why are they, as a group, opposed to it?
Right. So Holly's asking why beverage association distributors and beverage packers would be opposed to a container deposit system. And what it really boils down to is that it cuts into their bottom line. And the way that it cuts into their bottom line is it requires them to produce different packaging. If you look at the top of a can in a state that has container deposits, it has different things stamped on it. That's an added cost. If you look at the responsibility for providing redemption centers, that oftentimes falls on distributors. There's no doubt at all that they do have an impact on their bottom line, absolutely. But they're also gaining a lot of money from people buying their product, and they're producing it in packages that can be recycled very easily. And I think a philosophical argument can be made that they and we share a responsibility to see these things stay in the production stream instead of in the landfill. Dana asked about whether glass containers would be more readily recyclable than aluminum and plastic. And that is true in some ways. One of the advantages of glass recycling in Walla Walla, now speaking specifically about Walla Walla and not other places, is that these containers are hauled off to the local the dump, basically, and crushed into material that's used in road building. So these containers can be very easily recycled locally without any shipping to other cities or states. There is one other aspect of glass recycling that doesn't come up a lot. There's two different kinds of glass containers. Some of them are refillable and some of them are not. Refillable containers obviously would have a higher value for people who want to return them intact. But you can take glass and drop it off at the local recycling centers, and if it gets broken here, it's not a big deal. But they're not shipped out of the area because it's not economical. It's the heaviest of all the recyclables.
So in states like Oregon that collect deposit on these things, not all of the items are going to be returned to get the deposit back.
That's true.
So what happens to that money?
Right.
The grocery stores collect, but they don't have to give back.
Yes. Holly asked an excellent question, which is, what happens to the funds that are left over when people don't return their containers for deposits? And if you look at the overall numbers, that can number in the hundreds of millions of containers. And what happens to that depends on the state. Some states, the law is the state keeps all of the deposit. Some of it is the state keeps part of the deposit and the redemption centers or the supermarket keeps part of it too. So what happens there is they collect that money. They don't have to pay it back out, but it helps pay their way. So like we were talking about earlier, it does hurt the bottom line of some companies initially to have these container deposit systems, but they can make some of that money back because no matter how good the redemption system is, people just don't bring them back. There's always going to be litter bugs who don't bring in their cans. And those cans pay for all of these systems. And if you look at Connecticut, which has 1.1 billion containers returned each year, and you look at the overall average for redemption rates, you're probably talking about $25 million in the bank in Connecticut to help pay for these programs. And that's all on the backs of people who didn't feel like taking their cans back.